Welcome back. Thanks for being with us. Welcome back to those who are joining us online. Boom, there we go. We are back. We had a difficult situation arise with a church member, and we prayed in advance before our recording. So we encourage you, those of you who are joining us online and after the fact, to pause the video and say a prayer. But otherwise, we are going to jump into our lesson here as soon as I get us to the right slide. We are in the Gospel according to St. Mark, and we are on the 4th chapter. One of these days I'll figure out a better way to do this. And we had started briefly, and we looked at the first few chapters, but then we were going to get back to this parable. And so I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read this parable again. Mark 4, verses 3 to 9.
I will do that.
Thank you.
Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. Then Jesus said, 'Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.'"
You. Okay, so unlike pretty close to every other parable that Jesus tells, we're going to get an explanation of this one. Jesus is going to tell us what it means. However, before we hear Jesus' explanation, I want to look at a few specific details and characteristics of the parable itself. So first off, one of the things that we might overlook as people living in a modern age, food accessibility is pretty good for most of us. We generally can run down to the store and pick up more food. A really long winter, a really dry summer is really not all that devastating. Might cause our prices to go up a little bit. But, it's at worst frustrating for the vast majority of us, at least in our country. And so when we approach these parables that talk about harvesting and growing and seeds and produce and all of this and what the product of the farmer is, one of the things we don't have the same visceral reaction that Jesus' culture might have is that for them, the harvest was live or die. If the food didn't come in, there was a good chance somebody in the community would die. If an entire harvest was wiped out, there was going to be famine, people would suffer, and in some pretty extreme ways. So when we're talking about a harvest, we should always keep in mind that at least the original audience is going to hear this as an almost life or death situation. Whatever is going on, whether the parable is intended to talk about life and death, there's still going to be that component at least in the back of the minds of the hearers when Jesus delivers this message or these parables. We jump into this text with being told, look, listen, this sort of like double command to pay attention, which is actually a little bit unlike Jesus, and it's a lot more similar to how the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 6 jumps into things saying, look, listen, pay attention. There's a big emphasis on paying attention. In this section of the Bible, we also get the word hear far more often than we get it in most other places in the Bible. Again, there's a big emphasis on this idea of paying attention, which all of chapter 4 is just packed with this language about being conscious of what you're listening to, paying attention. Don't let it be a casual listening. Don't let it be casual hearing, but really focus, be intent on what you're hearing or seeing, but especially what you're hearing. Now, one of the things that alludes to, as we've talked about before a couple of times, is the idea of more than any other book in the Bible, Mark is written as if it could be performed, as if it was almost as if it was intended to be performed to a live audience. So not just, hey, here's a book, read it, like most of us do, or chopping it up into little bits and chunks that we're going to read in bits and pieces in church, but rather that it would have been heard all in one sitting, as if somebody was watching a whole story, a whole play out. And so Mark gives us lots of clues to that. We've talked before about how Mark's chronology doesn't really follow a clean timeline in the life of Jesus, but rather kind of jumps around a little bit thematically. So we get a collection of stories about Jesus' life that focus on one thing, and then a collection of Jesus' stories that focus on another thing, so that there's an emphasis on this sort of scene in the play where we're getting a certain component of Jesus' ministry rather than a chronological retelling. And so this language that really emphasizes hearing, again, reinforces that idea of the performative function of this gospel compared to the other books in the Bible. And that might suggest that Mark had some Greco-Roman cultural background or experience, because that was a common characteristic of the Greek style of tragedy and comedy. You would often have the play choir, the chorus in a Greek play, who would turn and look at the audience and say, listen to this, or pay attention to that. And here we've got Jesus almost stepping into that function here of reminding us to pay close attention to what we're about to hear. Interestingly enough, Mark also tends to weave both Gentile culture, so in his context that's primarily the Greco-Roman culture, with Hebrew culture, the ancient traditions of Israel. And so again, while this emphasis on hearing might be performative in the Greek sense, it is at the same time for an Israelite audience going to be reminiscent of the prayer that they all know by heart. I mean, even your casual Israelite and your casual modern day Jew is going to know the Shema from Deuteronomy. And Shema is the Hebrew word that literally means to hear or listen. And so again, the idea that Jesus is repeating this word over and over again is reflective of the tradition, of the Israelite tradition, that of the context in which he's speaking. And so Mark, whether it's Jesus' words literally or Mark telling the story, the way Mark is often constructed kind of blends these elements of both Greek and Hebrew culture into a way that reaches two different audiences almost simultaneously. So again, as I've mentioned before, Mark's not very good at his Greek, he's not very good at his Hebrew, and he doesn't seem to know his geography very well. But the one thing he is a brilliant author. The way he tells his stories, the way he brings all of these elements together is really actually quite incredible, despite the simplicity of the language that he uses. Okay, so for the parable specifically, it might be interesting to note that at no point are we told who the sower is, right? Not in the parable itself, nor in the explanation that Jesus is about to give us. We're left to fill in that blank or make assumptions if we're going to allegorize this. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the distinction between a parable versus an allegory in a little bit. In this there's four things that happen, right? In the story, the seed gets described as going in four places. When we get three bad outcomes, but then when we get to the good outcome, that there's a harvest and something grows, we're not left with, and there was 100-fold harvest, right? No, instead we're given three good outcomes. Could have been 30-fold, or it was a 30, 60, or 100-fold, right? So within the parable itself, we're given three bad outcomes, all of which incidentally are the seed doesn't grow, right? It just dies. And three good outcomes, which similarly are the seed produces a good harvest. So we can look at it as there's three good and three bad, which we've talked before about how the number three is really important in Mark. It keeps coming up. Jesus seems to really like to do things in threes, and threes keep coming up. But also there's really only two outcomes. There's the good outcome, there's produce from this, and there's the bad outcome, which is the seed dies or the plant dies. There's nothing other than that in the parable itself. And then the last thing, because this seems to come up every time this parable comes up, is this question of 100-fold. Is it even possible in their time, with their technology, with their farming patterns? And this has been debated pretty heavily by scholars. Some people present this as 100-fold in this time period would have been such a miraculous turnaround, so incredible that what Jesus is presenting is something that could be a complete miracle beyond our wildest imaginings, right? There have been others who have gone back and tried to reconstruct agriculture of the time period and said, no, actually 100-fold is not shocking. I mean, it's good. It's really good. But it's not shocking. It's not beyond imagining, right? It's just a really exceptional result. Of course, that debate probably clouds the reality of what is going on here, and that the idea that the potential of 100-fold could be the produce of this might reflect a time period when for Israel 100-fold would have been a miraculous turnabout. If we go back 600-700 years, I think, to the time of Isaiah, about 600 years, to the time of Isaiah, and not Isaiah. This would have been 1,500 years, 1,800 years earlier. Genesis, to the time of Genesis, and we get the story in our Genesis story of Isaac having a produce of 100-fold in Genesis 26:12, and that's being described as the Lord's blessing, right? So for those who know their scripture, when they're hearing Jesus tell this parable, they're going to hear Jesus saying 100-fold, and they'll recall the story of Isaac and his 100-fold produce, which was the Lord's blessing. So there's an allusion in here to the Hebrew Bible of what's going on for the good result. Well, it's the Lord's blessing, right? Any questions about the parable itself before we jump to the explanation? Okay, or insights, comments? Okay. All right. Then, moving on, could someone read for us the explanation, which I think we jump over a couple of verses because we already talked about them, starting with 14 going through 20.
I can.
Thank you.
The sower sows the word, and these are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word which is sown in them. And these, in like manner, are the ones sown upon rocky ground, who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy, and they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the delight in riches and the desire for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. But those who were sown upon the good soil are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold.
Okay, thank you. For verse 19, does everybody have the cares of this world or the cares of the world? Does anybody have anything different in their version?
But worldly cares.
Okay.
There have been a couple little differences, but
Yeah, no, we've got a couple different translations in the room, and that's fine. The reason I asked is because in the Greek the word world doesn't show up at all. It's the cares of this age, which is, it's always interesting the choices that the translators make. Because we usually think of an age as a time period and the world as a place. So it's an interesting choice to make that transition. That means that most of our translators have interpreted the idea of this age as to be something that is sort of universal, and probably interpreting this age in the Christian context, the post-Jesus, post-early church Christian idea of the parousia, the second coming of Jesus, that there's going to be a time when Jesus is going to come again, and so we are still in the same age that they were in 2,000 years ago, right? And so to avoid any ambiguity where someone might interpret this age as the past, when Jesus was telling this, versus now, our translators choose to change it to the world. At least that's probably the intention behind changing the wording. But we talk periodically in here about the choices that the translators make and how they're often not a wooden reflection of what's in the text. Okay, so whose interpretation of the parable is this? It's Jesus who's speaking, right? So it's Jesus's interpretation? Mm-hmm. Well, so this is interesting because our parable, the parable itself, we've talked before about how Jesus' parables, and that includes this one, are polysemic, which means they are in instructional language that's meant to be interpreted by being engaged. So who you are, what your situation is, what you bring to the text is part of how you interpret a parable. They're sort of like Eastern cones. They're meant to be, it's meant for you to spend time thinking about and contemplating and engaging, rather than just, it's 2 + 2. Silly, by the way, the answer is 4, right? This is why Jesus teaches in parables, presumably, is because the answers are not something where Jesus can just come out and say, look, if you let Satan get you, you're not going to produce anything, blah, 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 right? The explanation is not polysemic. It is allegorical. Each thing represents another thing. That's the parallels, and therefore this is the one interpretation that this means. So Jesus is being a little weird in giving this kind of explanation to a parable. And as I mentioned before we jumped into it, this is pretty rare. Jesus usually doesn't explain parables. Usually they're just left for us to sit with. But there's a lot more going on than that. The parable itself gives relatively equal time to the good results and the bad results. And yet, the explanation is heavily focused on the bad results. And in fact, it barely cares at all about the good results. In fact, we don't even get an explanation of what the good results are. It's just a repeat of the parable. The explanation doesn't care at all what the good results are or explaining what the good results are. It only matters if we explain what the bad results are, which is kind of an interesting way to explain a parable, right? It's like, here, let me focus on the bad news. The parable itself, we talked about, is kind of dualistic. There's 3 good outcomes and 3 bad outcomes, but really all 3 of the bad outcomes are the same. The seed dies. And all the 3 good outcomes are the same, more or less. They produce much produce, right? But there's 4 different outcomes in the explanation. 3 bad ones, which are each different from each other, and 1 good one, which, again, well, we don't really care about because we're not going to bother giving any extra detail to that. So it's kind of strange. Additionally, there's a consistency problem in the explanation. Because if this is an allegory, then each thing represents one other thing. And so when we try to explain it away, each thing means something. But if we look at verse 14, the sower sows the word. What does the sower sow in the parable? Seeds. So the seeds are the word. Well, then jump down to 16, 18, and 20. Let's see here. 16. And these are the ones, the seeds, that are sown on rocky ground where they hear the word. So, I mean, that's just 16, but in 18 and 20 we get the same thing. Suddenly the seeds are no longer the word, they're now the hearer of the word, right? So there's a strange inconsistency that's going on. And in fact, when we get to Matthew's version of this parable with the explanation, it's that problem's going to get fixed. We've talked about this several times already, and we're only 4 chapters into Mark. Matthew fixes Mark a lot. The problems that we run into where we're like, wait, Mark, that doesn't quite work. Matthew's like, yeah, I see that. I'm going to fix it. And then the last thing is that the parable itself is what we might call eschatological. It's about how things are going to end up in the end, right? And most of Jesus's parables have an eschatological quality to them. They're not about, well, if you do this right now, it's going to fix things tomorrow, right? It's not wisdom literature where this is how you should live in this very moment. They're usually the kingdom of heaven is like, or the kingdom of God is like. This is how things are going to be sometime down the distant future when God's work is done or when God's work is accomplished. So there's an eschatological quality about it. But the outcome, the point of the parable itself is focusing on the yield, that there's going to be produce. The good part of the story, right? The good part of the parable. Whereas the explanation itself is much more interested in behavioral qualities. Who do you listen to? How do you live your life? How do you engage the word? Where do you spread the word? Those sorts of things, right? There's a different emphasis in the two. Also, it might be worth noting that Jesus' explanation wouldn't make very much sense to the disciples at this point of the story. They don't know who Jesus is. They haven't figured out that he's the Messiah. They haven't been told that he's going to go and be crucified and die and raised from the dead. This explanation doesn't really fit in very well to this early part of the story. However, it works great if you're living in the post-resurrection time period and you're attending Mark's church and Mark's telling you, hey, by the way, this is what that parable means. It makes a lot of sense after you know Jesus' story, after you know who he is, after the resurrection, after you're looking back at all of the challenges that the church has faced, this new institution or this new body of people trying to follow God, all the things that have gone wrong over the last 20, 30, 40 years, then all of a sudden the explanation is, oh, by the way, this is why all those bad things didn't happen or didn't work out quite the way we wanted them to work out, right? Suddenly the explanation makes a lot more sense post-resurrection. And in fact, the interesting thing is, linguistically, when we look at the actual Greek being used here, a whole bunch of these words that show up in the explanation, Jesus doesn't use them anywhere else. Jesus doesn't use these terms to sow, meaning to preach, deception, untruthful, to bear fruit, or to fall away. This is the language of a church. This is the language that we actually find in other church documents from the couple centuries after Jesus has died and been raised, right? This is not the language. These Greek words are not the language of Jesus' ministry. They're the language of the post-Jesus church, the early church. So, and then the final piece to consider in this is, we've talked before about one of the things that's really fascinating about the gospel according to St. Mark is that generally when Jesus speaks in this, the linguist can take the Greek words that are written in Mark's Bible, and they can almost one for one parallel them back to Aramaic, so that they make sentences that make sense in Aramaic. They're well structured in Aramaic, and on a number of occasions they actually make better Aramaic sentences than they make in Greek sentences, and yet the gospel is written in Greek. And this is one of those indications that Mark may be drawing on either texts that were transcribed listening to somebody speaking Aramaic, or Mark himself is transcribing from listening to someone speak Aramaic. But that's only true of the texts that quote Jesus. The story parts of the text are relatively decent Greek and don't translate very well into Aramaic, which gives us a suggestion, and other scholars have implied this or come right out and said it, that generally, most of the times in Mark when Jesus speaks, what we're probably getting are the actual words of Jesus that somebody heard and tried to write them down in Greek because they probably couldn't write in Aramaic. And so they understood the spoken Aramaic word and tried to quickly write them down in Greek. And that's how we get Mark's versions of what Jesus says. However, in this explanation that we get where Jesus is supposedly saying it, does not translate well back into Aramaic. And it makes a better set of Greek sentences than Aramaic sentences. So there's all kinds of things that indicate that this passage was not actually spoken by Jesus, most likely. And rather, Mark is providing an explanation, or somebody that Mark is drawing upon is providing an explanation for the church in a post-resurrection world that provides us as the church with one way to interpret Jesus' parable, given the context of challenging circumstances and things not always working out the way that we would expect them to. Now, that's not to say you have to take it that way. I know a lot of people like to take the Bible as it's written and assume that each word is true, and that's okay. Being able to recognize that this could be more a piece of interpretation than Jesus' literal word gives us the flexibility to work with the parable in more than its single explanation. And that's not to say that the explanation is invalid either. It can still serve as a legitimate explanation for us as the church in the world who are wrestling with what does happen to the word when it goes out into the world. How does it affect people? And what is the impact of it? There's nothing wrong with taking the parable or the explanation of the parable as one of a number of possible interpretations of the parable or a way of working with it. Thoughts, questions, comments? Moving on. Okay. We're going to get an interesting bit here. Can I get someone to read verses 21 to 25?
I will.
Thank you.
He said to them, "Is a lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed, and not on the lampstand? For there is nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. Let anyone with ears to hear listen." And he said to them, "Pay attention to what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given to you. For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away."
Okay, thank you. So the emphasis on listening and hearing makes sense here. When we just got done with the parable and the explanation of a parable and being told that the parables are only going to be explained or accessible to the insiders, to the disciples, and that those on the outside they're not going to get it, right? They're only going to hear the parables and not understand. So here we've got a paragraph that puts a lot of emphasis on listening and hearing, right? So it makes sense. It very well might be, and there's linguistic cues within this passage that suggest it probably is, that all of these expressions are just that. It's a collection of pithy expressions that have been shoved together. Again, this probably Mark's doing. We get some of these passages out of what we believe Q probably looked like, but most likely some of these passages actually even predate Jesus. They're phrases that were a little more commonplace and going around in the time. And so how they're stuck together can change how we might interpret them. So I want to look at these first standing apart from each other, and then kind of look at them in a group together. So at first we get two questions, right? We get, is a lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed and not on a lampstand? There's two different questions in there. And in the Greek, they're actually very specific, because Greek has this neat little component where if you ask a yes or no question, you can actually tell people which answer you want in advance. So how you mark a question in Greek, and you can ask a yes or no question without a specific expected answer, but you can also say I'm going to ask you this question, and I expect the answer to be no. And then I'm going to ask you this question, I expect the answer to be yes. We do that in English, but usually with our tone or inflection. There's actually words that they stick in to do that. So we know by looking at this that the first question was intended to have a no answer. No, a lamp is not brought in to be put under a bushel basket or under a bed. Yes, it is brought in to be put on a lampstand. Speaking of which, there's another fun thing with translation here. The Greek does not say the lampstand is brought in. It says the lampstand comes in, which even in Greek, it doesn't make sense. Lamps don't walk in on their own, right? So there's a little bit of implied allegory in here. Somebody is the lampstand. And of course, that's Jesus. But so we get those two questions. Jesus or the Word or whatever comes in and is not meant to be kept secret, which is interesting because Mark's Jesus for the first 8 chapters of the book spends a lot of time and energy trying to keep his identity a secret. And yet here we are only halfway through that, and he's like, I'm supposed to be revealed, but shh, don't tell anybody, right? So then we get two statements, which could be boiled down to there's no such thing as a secret. I had a third grade teacher who loved saying a secret is only a secret when it's between two people and one of them's dead. So we've got these expressions, for there is nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. So again, no such thing as a secret, and the truth always comes out, right? This is how we would phrase these same expressions in English. They've been around forever. These are the kind of things that are like, yeah, this is like common human experience. You can't keep a secret. It's not like Jesus came along and said, yeah, I know human beings have been talking to each other for the last 30,000 years, but by the way, you can't keep a secret? Sorry, Jesus, you're not original on that one. Then we get 2 imperatives, which sound very much like Mark's Jesus. Pay attention to what you hear. And the measure you will give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given to you. Again, we have that same expression in our culture, judge not lest ye be judged, right? When you point at someone, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you. Again, pretty common human experience. All of the things that Jesus is saying here are probably not Jesus being original or creative. These are common human experiences. We just are used to hearing them in different sets of words. And then finally we get these last 2 statements. And by putting them last, this kind of becomes an emphasis, right? So you hear a bunch of random phrases, and especially when you're told pay attention, right? It's usually that last thing that really sticks with you. And so what do we get? For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. We know those expressions. They're the poor, the rich get richer, and the poor get poorer, right? Those are not unfamiliar expressions. So we have this collection of expressions that talk about being rich and poor, about whether or not to judge other people, whether or not secrets can be kept, which, if you think of them each separately, they have very little to do with each other, right? They're just a collection of random wisdom expressions. You stick them all together and put your emphasis on the last one, pay very close attention to that, because we were just told to. And within this context, we get something more along the lines of, and this is a quote from Boring, the book, the interpreter that I primarily use for this course. Those who hear with insight will receive more insight. Those who hear only superficially have even that taken away from them. So, with the emphasis on this repetition of listen, pay attention, hear, this context that is, at least these last passages that are about money, get changed into, if you put in the time and effort, if you try to understand, if you try to delve the depths of what's being said, you'll gain even more insight. But if you're just going to listen passively, not only are you going to not get it, you'll get entirely the wrong thing, right? If you listen superficially to what I'm saying, you're not even going to hear the basic truth. Thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. And then we get another parable about seeds. Could I get a volunteer for 26 through 29?
Okay. He also said the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first a stalk, then the head, then the full grain of the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come.
Okay. This parable is unique to Mark. It doesn't show up in the other Gospels. Matthew is something that might come from the same source, but it's been reworked so much that it's not clear that it's the same parable. Interestingly enough, I mean, we talked about how the explanation had a number of problems that suggest that it was really written by Mark and not Jesus. Mm-hmm. We get a mix of that here. Some bits and pieces of this work well translated back into Aramaic, but others don't. There's a whole bunch of like little noodly nuancy things that only the scholars staring at it in its original languages are gonna likely to catch on to. And so we get this sort of weird mix of things that probably are all rooted in some kind of tradition, but have been worked together for this story. There's a good chance that at least a portion of this comes from the original Jesus, but probably not all of it. However, even by the time Mark gets it, it's already tradition. And remember, Mark is writing only about 30 years. I mean, the version of Mark that we have is being written only about 30 years after Jesus has died. So we're not talking about a huge amount of time for this tradition to develop. So a lot of it probably goes back to something that's relatively close to original. Some things to note in this parable. Remember, in our last parable, we were told about a sower, and we were not told who the sower was. Here we get a man, but he's not called a sower. Even though that's what he's doing, he's spreading the seeds around. This is probably very purposeful. There's some real intention going on here, and it ties in with the next point here, which is that the man's work is never mentioned in here. It doesn't say anything about him plowing. It doesn't say anything about him cultivating, right? He doesn't do any of the work that farmers would do once the seeds are in the ground. He doesn't even sow the seeds. He just scatters them. So the sowing that farmers do, not only does it not call him a sower, it doesn't even say that he sows the seeds. So again, his work is de-emphasized. And in fact, when it comes time for the harvest, it says he gets his sickle because the harvest has come, but doesn't say anything about him harvesting it. The way the verbs are structured in here makes it seem like the man did nothing at all, right?
And I was gonna say, at least with my translation, it goes with like the life coming in room, but like he sends in the sickle because the harvest has come, and I'm like, yeah, so it's like he didn't even go in the sickle. Just go,
Yeah.
sickle.
Yeah.
You do it.
Yeah.
Sleeps and rises.
Yeah, and there's some emphasis on sleeping and rising in there too, which again is the man's role in this parable is pretty passive, right? So we've got two things going on here. There's probably an original version of this that Jesus told, which at this point, because it's been muddied with tradition and all kinds of things, we can't even reconstruct it. We don't know what the original parable was like. So what we're left with is Mark's version of the parable. And so the point Mark is getting to seems to be to go ahead and sow seed, or go ahead and spread seed might be a better way of putting it. There's no need to control the outcome, right? God's the one in control. God's the one who makes the seed grow. It's not about the scientific process of germination and plant growth. It's the emphasis is on the human beings aren't really doing the work. This is really God's work. So, and more importantly, because you can't manipulate it. The plants are going to grow or they're not going to grow, and that's God's work. You don't have to be in control of the situation, right? Just go and spread the seed. Which is interesting because at least a portion of our modern church, and by church I mean the Church Universal, is very interested in controlling the outcome, right? We're here to tell you Jesus' word. Oh, and by the way, that means you have to do this and you can't do that, and now you have to live this way. And by the way, all the characteristics where the church tries to come into our lives and say, let me tell you how you have to live your life, because Jesus says so. When here we have a parable that kind of challenges that. No, just go and spread the word, the seed, right? And trust that God's gonna do the work, that God's gonna make it grow. There are some interesting studies, whether you agree with them or not, that suggest that's actually what's happening to the church in our modern world. That the efforts of some churches to put so much control, so much manipulation on how people live their lives is what's driving people away from the church right now. And if we would just come here and say, hey, we're here to study this Bible and just talk about it and try to get to know God and get to know each other and try to see if we can each figure out what God is trying to tell us in our lives, a lot more people would be interested in hearing the message than hearing that they're bad people who are living wrong and being told how they need to change. So maybe God can do the work with us just sharing the word. Maybe? Do we trust God that much? Where are we at for now? Okay, we got a little bit more time. Because we have even more seeds! Because, once you got seeds, you need more. All right. Do I have a volunteer for 30 to 32? Nice short passage. I can read. I got it. I haven't read yet. He also said, with what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet, when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. All right, so scientifically really bad. Jesus fails his botany exam. This, right? Because not only is the mustard seed not the smallest seed in the world, it's not even the smallest seed known to the Israelites in the time period in which Jesus says this. And the mustard plant is not the largest plant or the largest shrub either. So Jesus fails. But again, a parable is not about scientific accuracy, right? Again, it's sort of like an Eastern cone. You're meant to meditate on it, to wrestle with it, to bring it into your context and see how it fits or doesn't fit. How do we understand it in the moment? We do know that this is pretty early Christian material. There's good evidence that it actually comes from Q, that text that doesn't exist anymore, but we can kind of reconstruct what it probably looked like based on what we have. And it doesn't show up in Q or in the other writings that we have that are based on Q in this context with all these other seed parallels. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I just found it a little interesting. Both Matthew and Luke have this parable, but they stick it right next to the parable of the leaven, in which, I mean, they're almost verbatim in Matthew and Luke the same, in which a little bit of yeast leavens 3 measures of flour, right? So again, it's the same kind of message. A little goes a long way, right? Interestingly enough, Boring argues, based on the materials that we have, even though Mark decides to call it a bush or a shrub or a plant, most of the other texts that refer to this parable refer to the mustard seed as growing into a tree, which it's not. But again, scientific accuracy is not the point. And so Boring suggests, and I have a feeling he's probably right, that the original version of this referred to the mustard seed growing into a tree. And in that we get sort of an image of the world tree, right, which is more Scandinavian, but we get ideas of this from other religions around the world. This sort of idea that there is something that is all-encompassing of creation. And so in this case, the tree is God's kingdom. And so you have this thing that is produced out of something small. Right now you got Jesus and a handful of disciples. That's pretty small, right? And they're going to produce something, or that what will grow out of what they're doing will be something like God's tree, God's kingdom, which can provide shade and nourishment for many nations. In the context in which he's saying this, which is largely a desert context, this is pretty much miraculous. You go a little further north, the northern end of Galilee, maybe into the Assyrian plains. Yeah, you've got mustard trees, mustard bushes, whatever, that grow 9-10 feet tall. But for it to grow, especially in southern Israel, would be a miracle. There's just not enough water for plants like that. Or at least back then there wasn't. We have we've changed the geography of Israel today, so things are different. And from that we get this sort of surface meaning, right? Something small can do something miraculous, especially when God's involved, right? However, there's another possibly deeper layer to this going on, because mustard plants are a pervasive species. For the Israelites at the time, where there wouldn't likely have been there was no French's company, so there wouldn't have been this huge market for mustard. A mustard plant would have been a problem for farmers. It would have been really pervasive and would have caused problems for the crops that they really wanted to grow, that were good for feeding people and producing wine and grapes and all that other stuff, and good for economic reasons. So for a farmer, this would be a horrible thing. Like, Jesus, why are you giving me mustard trees? This is terrible. Mustard bushes. I don't want those things on my farm. So we could be seeing another layer to this parable in which the kingdom of God is something that for insiders, or the former insiders, would be seen as a problem, something we don't want. If you're happy with the status quo, if you're happy with the way things are, you don't want mustard trees being added to your farm. But for the birds, this is a great thing, right? It's the birds who are benefiting from the mustard shrub, not the farmers. And so there's an implication in here, or there could be an implication, that Jesus is talking about how the ministry of God that in the past has been largely limited to the nation of Israel might not be seen as good, especially for your establishment people, especially for the people who are supportive or protective of the Roman Empire that's occupying Israel in this time period, might not see this as good. And yet it is something that's good for the world, that is good for many, many nations, instead of just one or two. So there's a layered parable to this. And the fact that we could draw that added meaning out of this parable, right after we got told by Mark 12 different times, by the way, really pay attention to what we're saying here, listen carefully, try to dig in and get some real insight out of this. The surface meaning is probably not the limit of where this parable goes. There's probably a lot more intent to take this even further. Okay. I'm gonna squeak in one more because this is the end of Mark. This is the end of chapter 4, excuse me. With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. Again, we've got the same thing that kind of goes on with the explanation here, which is, by the way, if you're reading this gospel, you're going to hear a whole bunch of parables and not have them explained to you. But don't worry, there's somebody who knows the secret, who knows the meaning. This is classic literary pattern of don't worry, I can give you the right answer, right? The implication is if you're on the inside, you're going to get it, or you're going to have access to somebody who gets it. Again, written for the context of a post-resurrection church community. So, all in all, we get this this sort of interesting dynamic. Mark, not Jesus, is the one who explains the parables and how to understand them. Mark's got a baseline of the parables. They can't be understood until after the resurrection, right? Because that's all of his explanations are kind of given in this sort of context of, now that you know who Jesus is and that he's been resurrected, now you can understand what this is about. Because the idea of spreading the word at this point, there's not much word to spread. We're still very early in the story. So all these parables about spreading the word make a lot more sense after you've gone through the story all the way with Jesus to the resurrection. Mark puts a lot of emphasis on the idea that if you're an insider, if you're part of this Jesus community, you're going to get it. But if you're not going to get it. Which, if we understand that the explanations of the parables are only understood after the resurrection, there's a parallel between that and Mark's point that you're not going to get it if you're not a Jesus person. Because if you can only understand the parables by knowing about the resurrection and believing in the resurrection, then you're not going to understand the parables if you don't believe in the resurrection, right? It's like, let me tell you a story about apples. I don't know what apples are. Sorry, you're not going to understand my story, right? So if you don't know about the resurrection, or you don't believe in the resurrection, these parables aren't going to make sense. And that fits well with Mark's motif here about how parables function. But for Mark, there's still an answer. It's usually an allegorical one, though not always. Mark always has an idea that if you show up at the house church community, if you're part of what's going on, somebody's going to be able to explain these parables to you. There is an answer. In contrast, what we get from the way Jesus presents the parables, if we parse out the components that are part of Mark's work or part of the traditions that developed in the 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, we instead get a collection of parables that are polysemic. Again, that's something that is best interpreted by engaging it. It's not just the speaker who's teaching, it is also the learner who is part of the lesson, right? This is a lesson that can't stand on its own. It only makes sense when the listener is engaged as part of the teaching. For Jesus' parables, there's probably no single correct answer. Now, we can definitely say there are some wrong answers, right? You can't go and just make the parable say anything you want. But it's not you have to take it this way, otherwise you're wrong. There's some rooms for flexibility because, again, the parables are polysemic. And Jesus' parables are dynamic. They're not, again, when they're not based on a single answer, they're based on the context, on the people that are engaged in the story who are hearing the story. And as we've looked at with Jesus' ministry in Mark throughout this whole thing, we've seen the Jesus that's presented in Mark as having that as being characteristic of his ministry. We talked early on about how when Jesus is talking to Galileans and Judeans, the people who are on the inside, the ones who were raised with Hebrew and Israelite religion, he teaches and preaches as well as healing, feeding, and casting out demons. But whenever Jesus in Mark is outside of the home territory, the Israelite territory, he only heals and feeds and casts out demons. And he never teaches or preaches when he's talking to outsiders. So again, Jesus' very ministry in Mark is contextual. What Jesus does, how he does his ministry, depends on where he is and who's around him. And so the idea that the parables might fall into that same kind of pattern, that it matters where you are and who you are when you hear them, fits in with the whole pattern of Jesus' ministry. And that brings us to the end of our Bible study. Any thoughts, comments, questions to take it from there? Okay. We're going to close as we always have with the Lord's Prayer. So let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for watching us online, and God's peace be with you.